If you could go ahead and find a seat, we're going to get started. We're going to follow the precedent set during the last panel. We're going to get started before several of the panelists arrive. So we got our lead operator here, so that's enough to get started. I'm Doug Kinney with the Natural Resources Law Center. It is my pleasure to be the moderator of this panel. By moderator, that means I'll just try not to get in the way. We're going to talk about water issues. Several times this morning, people talked about water demands of a full-fledged oil shale industry, and we pushed up against that issue a few times, but didn't talk about it in detail. But now's the time to do that. First up on our panel, and maybe he'll be our only panelist, I guess we'll see, is Bart Miller, who is the Water Program Director of Western Resource Advocates. Western Resource Advocates has been one of the more vocal entities talking about concerns about oil shale development, and in particular the impacts on future water supplies. So Bart's going to get us started talking about some of those issues, drawing, I imagine, from the Water on the Rocks report that Western Resource Advocates has recently produced. Did you bring it? Oh, you did bring a show and tell copy. Very good. After Bart, we hope we'll have the presence of Ben Harden, who is a principal engineer with the consulting firm AMEC, Earth and Environmental. Ben's been doing some scenario-based research regarding industrial water needs, some projections of what a full-fledged oil shale industry might look like. He's going to talk about some of those projected water needs and where that water might come from. Then we'll conclude with Dan Birch, who's the Deputy General Manager and Chief Engineer of the Colorado River District. He's going to talk about the River District's concerns about oil shale and more generally some of the Western Colorado water interest concerns about oil shale. And he'll talk about how oil shale issues and concerns are being integrated into the IBCC roundtable process and related efforts such as the Colorado River Water Availability Study. So that's the lineup. I'm going to give each speaker 15 minutes, which hopefully leaves us some time for questions and answers. So Bart, why don't you come on up?
Off and running. Well, thanks very much. And I too hope that my fellow panelists arrive.
Well, you get 45 minutes.
I get 45 minutes, but I'm ready for about 10 or 12. I think it's amazing that even though there's, as many have presented, over 100-year history of oil shale issues in Colorado, it's still dynamic. If I had just one more hour to work on my presentation, I would have replaced oil shale with references to low-grade source rock or French fries, as I think at least one person mentioned. And I didn't have that time, and I think I'll start off kind of a broad discussion. I think we'll touch on a lot of topics related to water, and I want to make sure to give a shout out to the team of folks who put together the bulk of the material I'll be presenting, and that does, as Doug referenced, show up in Water on the Rocks, which is a report that came out just about 10 months ago. Western Resource Advocates put it together with a lot of help from Larry McDonald, former director of the Natural Resource Law Center, and the team from Western Resources that's here today includes Mike Chiropoulos, the Lands Program Director, Rob Harris, who did a lot of the background research going through the state engineer files, and David Abelson, who gave me a lot of help with today's PowerPoint. So I do want to present a little bit of a window on the world of oil shale related to water, and I think the only way you can do that any justice, you have to bring up the issue of climate change, because many of the effects of oil shale development would, if they take place, will be in the context of a world that's looking a lot different. Since BLM predicts that full-scale oil shale development, if it happens, would peak around 2050, and many of the climate studies that have been done are also looking at what will happen by 2050, and I think some of my fellow panelists, if they arrive, will talk about as well. Basin-wide, in the Colorado River Basin as a whole, there's a projected reduction in flow of somewhere between 6 and 20% by 2050. And the important piece, I guess, it's both a basin-wide issue and a local one. There have been new studies, one of which the state is conducting, and I believe Ben has been part of it, the Colorado River Water Availability Study, looking just at the issues of how much water will be available in various stream systems across the western slope of Colorado. And it turns out that at least in the very northeast part of that basin-wide map, in some of the places like the Yampa and the White River drainage, the studies I saw have a wide range of what potential climate change might do to flows. And some places, all places will be hotter, but some of those places in the northeast part of this large basin map will actually be getting wetter, or could be getting wetter. But as a whole, the basin will be getting hotter and drier. And that does have implications, which I'll get to in a moment, relative to the Colorado River Compact and how much water is left for Colorado to develop. So other panelists here will talk more about the actual demands, and I think some of the folks this morning spoke about, at least tossed out some of the numbers on demands. The numbers up on this graphic come from, in large part, the Energy Development and Water Needs Assessment. Phase 1 study was done by the Colorado Yampa, done for the Colorado Yampa and White Roundtables. And here, under a projection of 1.5 million barrels a day, the direct water demand, at least under this scenario, is over 100,000 acre-feet, and the electric power needed to actually process would be more than twice that amount. And then you have also the other water use that might come with increased populations, the kind of boom of new residents. So a very large potential acre footage, nearly 400,000 acre-feet needed on an annual basis to meet the demands. Those numbers may, I'll be interested to hear today if any numbers for the Energy 2 analysis will change some of those projections. But even if they do, I think it's important to point out just those numbers compared to what some of the larger cities, like Front Range cities of Denver, what their current demands are. You can see that Denver, serving somewhere around 1.4 million people, uses significantly less than the potential oil shale demand going forward. And certainly there are these questions about how much water will be used, what technologies will be chosen if this goes forward. And the key piece of that, because there's such a big energy component here, will be the energy sources. Will it be coal? Will it be gas? Will it be nuclear power? Those all are important questions because those all have different levels of water use. But our report didn't spend much time at all on the demand piece. Rather, we focused on what water rights have been acquired by energy companies in the furtherance of oil shale. And here, digging through the records, we found that the absolute rights, that is, water rights that are actually ditch rights, that would be converted to oil shale use, are total 650 cubic feet per second in more than 100 existing irrigation ditches. And that breaks down as about 50,000 acre-feet of storage in the Colorado River basin and about 20,000 acre-feet in the White. The even bigger numbers certainly come with conditional water rights. These are water rights that date back to the 50s and 60s, where different diversion structures and reservoirs have been proposed in the Colorado and the White. And you can see the numbers there total to something in the neighborhood of 10,000 cubic feet per second between the two basins and 1.5 million acre-feet of storage. And these numbers actually have been adjusted. The numbers on the screen here are different than the report. When the report came out, the River District said, oh, well, one of those big projects we're not planning on doing anymore, the Una development, and that was a fairly substantial, it was over 350,000 acre-feet of storage. So that's not in these numbers, but you can see that they're still quite big. So an effort here, I think, to kind of paint the picture of how many water rights have been acquired, both absolute rights and conditional rights. And the story goes on in the sense that there is a recent development, a new river basin that's in play, and that's the Yampa. Just over a year ago, the Shale oil company, Shale has filed for a water right on the Yampa, 375 cubic feet per second, and they propose to store at any given time about 45,000 acre-feet, but they have a right to refill that to some extent. That's a brand new type of water use proposed for the Yampa River Basin, and it did have lots of folks very interested and concerned. So I threw up there that there are 25 statements of opposition. That case is not far along at all at this point, but yet another basin that might be at play. One other thing I'll mention, and it kind of relates to a point made on one of the morning panels about other things that have happened since. A lot of what's being developed for meeting future needs across the state aren't just related to energy needs, but future municipal demands. And the state is involved in several processes right now, including the Interbasin Compact Committee, which is looking at how we meet future municipal demands. And somewhat related to that, not done for the IBCC, but just last week there was a report where the Front Range interests, many of the Front Range water providers, put together an economic assessment of the value of water in municipalities, talking about how much each acre foot of water produces as far as GDP. And I know a slide that came up earlier today was, well, it's only 1/10 of 1% of the water, but yet it would produce 1% of GDP. I think you'd have a lot of Front Range interests comparing that against how much each acre foot is worth to the Front Range. And that'll get to another point I'll make in just a second. So there's a lot of water rights, conditional and decreed, that oil shale would be making use of. And the substantial volume raises a lot of issues about how it would compact or contrast and compete with existing and future uses of water for other needs. And it's only in the last 30 years we've kind of come to recognize that water is not just valuable out of stream for farming and municipalities and mining, but it's also valuable for in-stream benefits as well, and recreational things like skiing. But it's important to point out what we found in the water right tabulations comparing oil shale conditional rights, again from the 50s and 60s and since, against existing diversions by many municipalities. And as folks know, there's a lot of water that's already coming from the upper Colorado River Basin to the Front Range of Colorado. In fact, it's about in excess of 400,000 acre feet a year that comes out of the headwaters and meets the municipal needs on the Front Range. And so one of the appendices in the Water on the Rocks report actually goes through the tabulation comparing some of the major oil shale rights against some of the dates and the priority of municipal rights. And there's a lot of folks who are interested in this. The River District, for instance, has Wolver Mountain Reservoir, which provides critical water for the West Slope, and that's a fairly junior water right, which would be junior to many of the senior conditional rights. Denver Water similarly has conditional rights and some existing uses that are junior to oil shale rights. And the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District, through its municipal sub-district, built the Windy Gap Firming Project. Probably many people in this room get some water from the Windy Gap Project for about 12 of the communities north of us here. And the Windy Gap Project has a priority date from 1967, so that many of the oil shale rights it developed will be senior to that right. So very interesting questions to be asked about if this goes forward, what kind of impacts. And of course the other things that are useful to point out are what other things, whether competing uses and limiting factors might there be. I point out two here on the left. I got a couple of the species of the 4 endangered warm water fish on the west slope, and I think a previous map today had some of the critical habitat in the Green River, I think it was. But there are quite a few of these species in the Yampa and elsewhere. And the important part is the recovery program that's trying to bring these fish species back from extinction has actually set up some ground rules and some caps on how much additional development will come out of rivers like the Colorado. In fact, the biological opinion for the Colorado River endangered fish talks about an increment of 60,000 acre feet of additional development that's presumed to happen, but then there'll be a check-in on how are the fish doing, how are the populations of these endangered fish doing. So that 60,000 acre feet of assumed development, if the fish are doing well, there might be another increment of another 60. But importantly, Denver and Northern together have proposed water projects already in the NEPA process for about 50,000 acre feet. So almost all of that depletion increment is largely spoken for if those projects go forward. The folks on the right of this slide are folks signing the 1922 Colorado River Compact. And as I think many people in the room will be familiar, it's an agreement, though a layperson might say it's a sharing of the Colorado River between the upper and lower basins. Indeed, it's not. It's a commitment by the upper basins to deliver a volume of water every year over a 10-year average to the lower basin. It's an agreement that actually has the risk of uncertainty placed on the upper basin states. So as we've been able to refine how much water the Colorado River watershed provides, what we've discovered is the upper basin got the short end of the stick. There's less water than they thought basin-wide. When they wrote the compact in 22, they were looking at a very wet previous 10 or 20 years of record, and so as a result, the upper basin states aren't getting or aren't entitled to as much as they thought 60, 80 years ago. And as a result, there are some limits that the compact will play. In fact, I think Eric Kuhn from the River District wrote a wonderful piece just about 2.5, almost 3 years ago now, looking at the question of how much water is left to develop in Colorado. Statewide, he kind of broke it into categories of really no risk for development of another 150,000 acre feet, but as you start getting into a moderate risk of over-allocating or over-developing our allocation, and you go up into the 200 or 300,000 acre foot range. So in a very real sense, as I was trying to point out in the very first slide, the basin-wide aspect of this is really important because as a state, we'll bump up against our total use of our total allocation at some point, probably in my lifetime, and it's important for us to make those decisions to the extent we can about how we make use of that water. So our future, will it have oil shale? Well, these are statements by a lot of prominent folks around the state about what would happen if we had large-scale oil shale development. And our conclusion, both based on these and some of our own thinking, is that commercial oil shale development would greatly transform western Colorado communities. It would also affect Colorado's Front Range communities and must be thoroughly evaluated and understood before we kind of let that happen as a matter of course. And it will accelerate climate change, as many have spoken this morning about the concern over increased greenhouse gas emissions. Certainly this raises a lot of questions about how much water will actually be needed compared to the water rights, which are above and beyond by many times the actual needs, and the energy impacts of how much and what kind of energy development goes forward. So just to conclude, I think, as many others have raised, we're in a place where we're at least 20 years and maybe hundreds away from actually having this come to be. And to answer the questions, we need to answer some of these very important questions today, and we have the chance to do that during the next several years and decades. And there are important ones about clarifying how much water would actually be used, what sources of energy would be available and made use of, and what would be the water consumption from those types of energy generation. And how will we deal with this big picture question about competing resources and competing needs? There is going to be a finite, certainly variable year to year, but a finite amount of water for the state, West Slope and Front Range combined. And so we need to find out how we're going to make the best use of that. So in conclusion, we're certainly, we want to have a lot more clarity on the answers to these questions before oil shale goes forward.
Thank you, Bart. As you can see, our panel is magically here, so we will keep going. We'll hold questions till the end. So, Ken, you missed your big elaborate introduction, so I'll trust you to do that. And there's a timer going there for you.
I don't know if Doug mentioned, I actually worked on one side of the shale oil industry back in the 70s looking at treating oil shale resource waters. I'm going to be as brief as I can here because I know you've all been waiting all day to hear Dan. So I'll try to go through this very quickly, but I'm going to describe a project that we've done, working closely with Dan, to look and refine some of the estimates of water needs for the oil shale industry. This came about as part of the Colorado Water for the 21st Century Act, called the HB 1177 process, which is a statewide planning process. And this was the brainchild of Russ George, and I believe Peter Nichols, who I know was also potentially an unindicted co-conspirator in that little plot to start this statewide process, which has turned out probably differently than anybody envisioned. But there's 9 basin roundtables that work in their basins, represent their basins, and formulate water needs assessments. An interbasin compact committee, which I think really was intended to be a venue for discussions among the basins, potentially for the interstate compacts that Russ George envisioned. And then provided for funding for special studies, which brings us to the water needs assessment, which is one of those special studies. And this is a project of a Colorado River Basin and the Yampa White River Basin roundtables, we recognized that water use for energy in general, but particularly oil shale, was going to be spread across 3 different basins. And it involved 2 phases. The first was estimating in the broad scale all of the energy development water needs. And then the second was evaluating water supply alternatives to satisfy those needs. And it's that second phase that we are working on now. So in phase 1, they developed a set of industry production scenarios and then associated water usage, estimated water usage for those. And there was a bit of discussion about the validity, reality, the realism of those production scenarios. So I've taken the time frames off these because that was the big issue that industry had raised, was that you can't expect this industry to grow as fast as it might have been envisioned in the phase 1 report. The low is always 0, that there won't be any industry, but there might be an ongoing R&D activity. And then there was a medium level of development, and we'll talk a little bit about how to interpret these. There was about 500,000 barrels per day, half a million barrels of in situ production, 50,000 barrels per day of above ground production, underground mining and above ground retorting in the Colorado River Basin, and the 500,000 acre foot of, or the 500,000 barrels per day of production would be out of the Piceance Basin by in situ. And that required about 135,000 acre feet of water per year by their estimates. And then the large or the high scenario was 1.5 million barrels per day of in situ production in the Piceance Basin, and 50,000, the same 50,000 barrels per day of above ground retorting in Colorado, with a water requirement of 380,000 acre feet per year. The phase 2 task was really to refine these, review them and refine them, and then localize the water use estimates and develop water use scenarios based in part on the projected size and location of the industry. But that can be put into a model to evaluate the impacts on water resources conditions. We are also going to evaluate the use of Piceance Basin groundwater, both for quality and quantity, and potential tributary connection. That is, whether or not the use of the groundwater from those aquifers will impact surface water resources, in which case then an augmentation plan would be required, and essentially you're really just using surface water but in a different place. We then formulate some water supply project alternatives and develop a model, a water rights model, water resources model, and analyze those alternatives. One of the criticisms of the phase 1 study was that the time frame for development of the industry was too short. So at industry's suggestion, we went and looked at the history of the Athabasca oil sands, and this has been brought up several times, but as a way of trying to either validate or adjust or refine those time frames, or even validate the scale of the industry that was considered the kind of large-scale industry. And one of the points that's been made here before is this is a much simpler situation. There's a lot less overburden, it's shallower, it's surface mined, it's not consolidated. So it's an imperfect analogy, but it is useful to look at. And the first separation process was developed in 1926. The first commercial extraction at 30,000 barrels per day. There's more than one number for this, but this is sort of what I think is the best estimate for what that capacity was in 1967. The interesting thing here is by 2005, there was production of about 750,000 barrels per day, and a year later, it had increased by about 50%. So what you see is that this is a very scalable thing. Once it gets going, it can expand rapidly. Probably not quite as rapidly given the amount of drilling and preparation that's required to recover in situ oil shale, but still it can happen quickly. And the long-term growth rate, when you go back and look at this, is remarkably stable at about 12%, even through all the market fluctuations and everything. It's kind of interesting, at least based on the fairly sparse information you can get on the evolution of the industry. And so if you extrapolate to the Piceance Basin, the bottom line is that the 1.5 million, 1.55 million barrel per day industry that the phase 1 study envisioned is certainly plausible if the industry develops and it's not constrained. and it could be reached by around 2060 based on the kind of development you saw in the Athabasca oil sands. So while the phase 1 time frame was probably a little bit optimistic or pessimistic, depending on your personal perspective on the industry, early, it wasn't outrageous, and we still think that the 1.5 million barrel per day industry is reasonable as at least one point for planning. One of the big uncertainties, I'm going to address a couple uncertainties and then list a number of them at the end, is this issue of electrical energy, which has been talked about a lot. And the question is, what in situ technology is going to prevail? Is it going to be electrically heated technology, or is it going to be combustion, or downhole burners, or some other heating method? I finally decided to put this in perspective because I've been thinking about the water, so I did a little bit of arithmetic to figure this out. And this is a lot of electricity for a 1.5 million barrel per day in situ industry. It's 120,000 gigawatts per year, and that's well over twice what Colorado's total generating capacity was. And we had been talking in this whole water planning process of where the energy would come from, and one of the scenarios was, well, we get electrical energy out of the Yampa Basin. There'd be further development of the Yampa River coal-fired thermal power. But when you look at that and you realize the Craig Station is only a 12th of this energy need, you realize that it's just not going to happen for air quality purposes and fuel resource reasons and water resources reasons. So that has given me a lot of pause to think about the uncertainty in the numbers that we're going to talk about here in a minute. One of the other options is on-site combined cycle gas turbines. It's been mentioned a couple times today that the in situ processes produce gas and enough gas to actually heat themselves and run themselves. If they don't, the process can be optimized or adjusted to produce more gas. So this is one option, and the combined cycle gas turbines use about a third of the electrical or the water resources per megawatt hour. And then the other option is somewhere else, which is always there. It's hard to know if that's going to happen. Likely, if we have to choose a winner and we're going to have an electrically heated industry, the likely winner is probably combined cycle gas turbine in the basin. So here are the water needs estimates, and sort of paraphrasing Mark Twain, there's nothing like a presentation to focus a man's attention. And so I realized, and we've had some discussions amongst various people involved in the water planning processes here, that we really ought to provide even a broader range of alternatives and show how the estimates of unit values affect the range of estimates. We have the advantage in this phase 2 of working more closely with Glenn and other folks from the industry to get a little more information directly from industry, but in getting that information, it was one of the ground rules was that we weren't going to be able to see directly proprietary information from industry sources, and so it had to be aggregated, and so we lost a little bit of that range. For example, there are technologies that use no electricity. There's technologies that use a lot. There's other aspects of water production and water use that are also variable. But the bottom line down at the bottom, if we look at the total water supply requirement in Colorado, if we adopt the somewhere else, or the other way to think about this, if all in situ processing is done with downhole gas-fired heaters or some combustion process or some other process, the water requirements are about 100,000 acre-feet per year for the 1.55 million barrel per day industry. If the combined cycle gas turbines are used, it's about 170,000 acre-feet per year. And if thermal generation is used, and it's just, to me anyway, it seems infeasible to do that in our study area, then we'd be looking at as much as 300,000 per year. And these are somewhat less than the estimates, about a third less than the estimates you saw in phase 1. Even when you compare the thermal, which is the basis that those numbers were presented as, because we took into account that there is water co-produced as a byproduct, and that water will have to be treated to disposal standards, and it might as well be reused. And so that water is available as a processed water as well, and that's a fairly substantial impact on the net water use. So I'm just going to go fairly quickly here because my timer is telling me I'm running short of time and I don't want to shorten your experience with Dan. But we looked at the groundwater in the basin, and the bottom line is it's not likely to be a regional resource. There might be local situations where it becomes useful, but it's fairly low quality water, and it's difficult to develop and expensive. So surface water supply really looks at three options. I think Bart talked about these. Water from the Colorado River imported, water from the Yampa River imported, and then native water out of the White River. And so one of our tasks is to develop conceptual projects. So in the White River Basin, we've got 3 reservoirs identified from old studies that were done 80 years ago, but most recently in the 80s. We're not going to consider groundwater as a resource. In terms of imports from the Colorado River, we're looking specifically at Exxon's change case, which was made, I guess, a year ago December, which gives us a good concrete target to work for. And then we're going to look at Shell's proposal from the Yampa River, but we'll treat that simply as an import into the basin. We won't try to represent the impacts in the Yampa. So these are the proposed diversions from the Colorado, just as kind of a graphic to give you something to look at. But basically, they're changing the point of use of those reservoirs in the upper part of Parachute Creek and then a big pumping station down on the Colorado River near Parachute to be able to use that water in the White River Basin, in the Pions and Yellow Creek drainages. So we'll be simulating that particular change case. It's nice because it gives us a portfolio of water rights and a set of projects to work from. And then in the White River Basin, there's 3 potential reservoir sites, 2 in the upper part of the basin, Lake Avery enlargement on Beaver Creek and the Warner Point Reservoir on the main stem, and then another reservoir, Wolf Creek, down at the bottom, which would only probably be useful for direct use as opposed to exchange if some kind of industrial processing like upgrading of oil takes place in Rangeley. So then we go through a process where we develop a water rights portfolio from the identified energy rights, the thing that Bart has talked about. Assign those or associate those with some storage and diversion facilities and put them into a model basically, and then we're going to evaluate the overall impact of those projects on both other water rights and on their ability to meet the combined needs of the basin itself, other parts of the economy, and the energy industry. And then I just wanted to leave you with these. The list sort of overlaps a lot with what Bart put up there and what you've seen other people say. I mean, first of all, will there be any oil shale industry? I was going to talk about that in terms of the second law of thermodynamics, and I was glad to see Mike Tupper beat me to that because it would make my life uncomfortable if I brought up the second law of thermodynamics first. If there is an industry, can its scale be managed? Will it grow in an unmanaged way and go past 1.5 million barrels per day? There's no magic boundary there. It'll be interesting to see what the oil sands do now if they continue to 2 million and more. What in situ technology will be used? If there's an electrically heated technology, where is that electricity going to come from? And where will upgrading and refining be done? Upgrading is a fairly substantial water use. In fact, without upgrading, this is what you need to do to the shale oil product to get it to be compatible with the normal world of petroleum transport and refining. Without upgrading, the water needs directly related to production of in-situ oil shale are fairly modest. And if that's not done in the basin, then that'll be another water demand that doesn't have to be met. And then we haven't included any refining. I mean, currently the oil from Colorado goes, I think, mostly to Salt Lake City, but there's not anywhere close to enough pipeline capacity to move this much oil there, and who knows where that's going to happen, where that's going to be done. And then one of the energy representatives brought this question up, and that is, are the energy companies going to coordinate their water supply efforts, or are they going to do what he called scramble? And I think that's a good question. Will we see overlapping systems of water supply, all trying to meet the same needs, or the same kinds of needs, but for different companies? And then finally, as Bart mentioned, how much water is there going to be available in the system as we look forward to potential changes in climate? Now, what's waiting for?
kind of building me up there. I will try and keep you awake after lunch. I hate being in this position. I'll do my best. Is it just page up and page down here?
Yeah, or the,
Okay, thanks. I'm going to talk a little bit and try and put this oil shale issue and the water issue related to oil shale in the context of two things, and both of them Bart and Ben have mentioned, and that is this current statewide effort at water planning, and then also in terms of the Colorado River Compact. I'm really not an expert in either one of those, but I'm really fortunate in that Ben is in the compact because he's working on the Colorado River availability study, which I'm going to mention. And Jacob Bornstein is here. Or did you leave? Okay, good. So if there's any really hard questions, I'm just going to dodge it. But Jacob's with the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and he's really been hip deep in some of the statewide planning stuff. The other thing I just wanted to mention at the outset is I'm going to take a pretty parochial view, and I'm going to give you the West Slope perspective. Doesn't necessarily represent the position or views of the Colorado River District, unless you like it. If you like it, it's the views of my organization. If you don't like it, it's my personal views. I'm just doing it to try and stay out of trouble today. Oh, shoot.
How's it going?
I'm going to stop the clock. Oh, sorry. I think I skipped the ends. Okay. A little bit of propaganda about the Colorado River District. We're a creature created under state statute. We cover everything in Colorado that's in the Colorado River Basin and its tributaries. So basically everything from the Yampa on down to the main stem of the Colorado and the Gunnison. We comprise all or part of 15 counties. And we have a board of directors. We're self-governed, and we have a board of directors that's appointed by the county commissioners in each one of those counties. So our interests are a little diverse. You know, we have headwaters counties, and they're pretty impacted by Trans Mountain diversions. We have obviously a great deal of energy stuff going on. You know, and we may even be a little schizophrenic. Just a few caveats, again, trying to stay out of trouble here. You know, we're not a proponent or opponent of oil shale per se. We're not a regulatory body at all. We're a water provider in a certain sense. We get involved with water policy issues. We get involved with legal matters. We came into being 70 years ago as a foil to the construction of the Colorado Big Thompson project that brings water to the Front Range. And we're out trying to protect western Colorado interests in water. We do want to play a role in sound water planning, and Ben mentioned one of these things. You know, if oil shale is going to happen, it's not going to happen for any reason that we have to say about it. But if it does happen, it seems to make sense to me that we engage in some good water planning. And not only can we avoid the spaghetti bowl of industry going out, essentially doing their own things in terms of water planning and development, but can we also look at a project or two that might not only serve energy interests, but an industry interest, but could also serve other interests in the basin. Agriculture in the White, for example, has no storage supplies. That's a problem in years like 2002, which, by the way, may be happening again this year. There are environmental needs for water. And is it possible to develop a water supply that addresses not only the industry's needs, but others? I don't think that's a Pollyannish view, frankly, because I think if you're constructing a storage project, your incremental cost of adding another foot of storage or another 1,000 acre-feet of storage is actually quite small. And I think for energy interests, you know, if they think they're going to be able to design and permit a single-purpose storage project, you know, I think history would suggest that they're better off really considering how they might be able to address multiple needs. So hopefully that's the last soapbox for a while. And again, the other big factor, and I'll talk about this, is there's an effort undergoing in statewide water planning, and we're basically talking about who's going to get to use the last increment of water available in the Colorado River. Is it going to go to a large new or additional trans-mountain diversion? And that's certainly a possibility. Our view is, from the west slope, again, pretty parochial view, we just want to make sure that west slope needs for water are considered in this process. Ben mentioned the House Bill 1177 that created these basin roundtables. This study that Ben and I have been involved with, that really forms one of those water needs assessments. But this is happening on a statewide basis, and Front Range is engaged in this process of identifying what their own water needs are. And then we have the IVCC, and they're currently looking at ways of, and they're identifying different portfolios to meet what's called the gap. And I'll show you what the gap actually is, but in essence, the gap is the difference between the water demands and available supplies. So here's an example of it. You can think of it here. Here's existing supplies. Here's growth of demands. And then you have a high growth scenario, a medium growth scenario, and a lower one. Here are existing supplies. This is a new term of art called IPPs, identified projects and processes. This is the stuff like the Denver's Moffett expansion and Northern's Windy Gap firming project. So these are the planning efforts that are currently underway. And so here's one assumption: if those are 100% successful, they'll result in this additional amount of demand. And then this is really the gap that we're talking about. And we're talking about big numbers here. So we're basically talking about water needs potentially on the order of a million acre feet. So this is one example that's being looked at by Jacob's group. But there's different ways of looking at it. What if all those IPPs are not completely successful? Then that just drives up your gap a little bit. You really need to be looking at more water supply. And not only that, but there's scenarios under climate change, declining groundwater yields in the South Metro, where existing supplies may decline somewhat in the long term. And again, it has the effect of just aggravating your need for future water. I'm not going to go into this and talk about this in great level, but there's different scenarios that you can look at. And this goes into the context of the study Ben's been working on. But supplies may actually decrease in the future. And if you have lower demands with lower supplies, that's a scenario. But you can have lower supplies with high demands, and that creates a greater level of uncertainty and a greater level of need. And so, this process that the state is engaged in, and we're really getting down to some pretty good stuff, and I really want to commend the work that the state's doing. But there's a number of ways and a number of different scenarios that these are being looked at. In essence, what's happening in terms of statewide water planning, we have growth in demands. And the growth in demands can really be satisfied looking at, for all intents and purposes, three different things. What's happening on the Front Range right now is a lot of the new demands are being satisfied by the dry-up of agriculture. And that's a concern of folks on the Front Range. Or demands can be satisfied by additional water conservation. And then the third one, and these are portrayed in the green here, is some additional trans-mountain diversion from the Colorado River. So there's trade-offs here, and I'm not going to go into the details of all this. My next slide is more of a graphic, but the state's really developed a nice little tool so you can play around with this, and there's trade-offs. Obviously, if you have a larger diversion out of the Colorado River, then that reduces the need to do agricultural dry-up on the Front Range. So here's an example of what's being looked at. And again, this is just an example, but here are the needs you're satisfying, and here's where it would come from. And in this particular scenario, in red is an additional increment of water supply from the Colorado River, and it's on the order of what's being talked about now is thinking on the order of, say, 350,000 acre feet. All right, so that's the state planning effort. I'm going to talk very briefly about compact. We could spend days and days talking about this, and like I said, I'm not the most qualified person to do this. But this is a slide from the study that Ben's working on. And the big question is, how much water in the Colorado River is left to develop? And I think conventional thinking has been that perhaps there's on the order of 500,000 acre feet. And if you consider full use of existing systems, for example, Denver's Dillon system, which could yield maybe another 75,000 acre feet or so. But if you consider full use of existing plumbing, really what you might have left is about 350,000 acre feet. Ben's been working on this, and one of the things he's expert in is looking at what different scenarios for water supply might mean under different climate projections. And, you know, there's actually scenarios in which water supplies could increase with climate change. But we're basically dealing with a high level of uncertainty. But I think the important thing here to bear in mind is the actual water supply that could be available, left to develop from the Colorado, could essentially be zero or something very close to it. So if you want to take a middle range, I think what this might suggest is something on the order of 350,000 acre feet that the state's currently using is probably a pretty good number. All right, so just a few final thoughts for you. I don't know what's going to happen with oil shale. I mean, it's kind of an intriguing thing to me. But I do think that one scenario that might happen with oil shale is if it's going to happen, it's going to happen because it can be done. It's technically and economically viable and environmentally viable, I suppose. But there would be some national priority or some national urgency to doing that. Is that a likely scenario? I don't know. But I think it's a possible scenario. And I think under that circumstance, I'm not sure that what the River District or what Northwest Colorado or what even the state of Colorado has to say about oil shale is going to matter. If there's a national urgency or national priority for doing it, I think it might happen no matter what any of us in this room happen to think. I think there are a number of things that could be limiting for oil shale development. I don't happen to think, given the numbers that we're talking about here, that water is going to be a limiting factor for that. I think there might be environmental limitations, obviously technical limitations, regulatory limitations. But I think if the industry is going to go, I think they either are going to be able to perfect their existing conditional water rights, appropriate new water rights in order to do that, or if they're not able to do that, I frankly think they're going to be in the business of acquiring other currently perfected water rights. And realistically, those water rights are agricultural water. And from a West Slope perspective, just in the same vein that the Front Range doesn't particularly care to see its agriculture dry up, I would not want to see that on the West Slope of Colorado either. And then the other thing is if we're talking about potential new demand satisfied from the Colorado River on the order of, say, 350,000 acre feet, and we're talking about an oil shale industry that might use Colorado River supplies on the order of several 100,000 acre feet, we're really talking about the fact that there is not enough water from the Colorado River to do all of that. So who's going to get that water? How's that going to play out in the future? It's not an easy question. I'm not claiming to have any answers here, but it is something that we're, folks in the water industry, folks in government in Colorado are going to have to grapple with. So I'll end there.
get as much as 25 minutes for questions and answers. The panels this morning, I guess we started the question and answer period by letting the panelists ask questions of each other, but I'm thinking we can maybe skip that with this panel, because you guys seem to be philosophically pretty much on the same team here. You could jump in if you disagree. So let's jump right to audience questions. So, who's got a question? Yeah.
Yeah, Bart, the numbers you put up there for oil, is that the mid-range of your estimate of water use from oil shale?
The numbers for use were directly from the phase 1 study, and they were towards the high end. They were the 1.5 million barrel a day industry, and they were in the neighborhood of 375,000.
And how many barrels per barrel?
That was using, I think, again, it was using the assumptions for demand that the roundtable did. It had, I think, a couple different pieces. Dan, you can go into the detail on this. You know, it's different barrels of water per barrel of oil for the in-situ and the surface. And they're, I guess, one of you can speak to the actual numbers. It's, you know, in the range. I mean, it's all over the range between 1 and 5 barrels of water to a barrel of oil.
It's more than 5.
No, Bart, I think I can answer that. I'm just doing some calculations. The numbers on the screen there, the total numbers that were shown corresponded to about 4 to 1.
I did 5.18 to 1. So it's the very high end of the range of possible barrel per barrel usage. And you didn't present any numbers for the low end?
Those are meant to be the up to amount. They're high end of the energy one.
But that's not stated in your report.
Well, I think
it's studied as estimated.
Yeah, the report actually discussed. I think it gives the caveat, the assumptions behind the range of barrels of water per barrel of oil, and then refers, I believe, to the potential need for the potential water demand.
It's the very high end of your range. There's no numbers presented for the low end.
Let me jump in here for a second, and then I'm going to have Ben talk about it. I'm going to talk a little bit about phase 1. And, just to be in fairness to Bart, the numbers he was reporting weren't from, in terms of demands, were from the Basin Roundtable's phase 1 report. When we did that report, we we did a literature review, and we were looking at unit demands for oil shale that were previously cited, like the RAND study, for example, that we talked about. One of the reasons they might appear high was because we not only were considering the direct water demands associated with oil shale, we were also including water needed for the power necessary for that, and then also population components.
The estimate was still 5, even with all those integrated. So your
Right.
values are the very high end of your range, not representing the range. They're not.
Let me just add one more piece to this, and then Ben's going to talk about this. We actually had, when we did the phase 1 study, we actually got a fair amount of criticism because on the upper end of our demands, we were about 400,000 acre feet. And industry felt that the Roundtable's study kind of overstated that. So we've had that criticism before, and we understand that. We made a commitment in the phase 2 study that we would re-examine the water demand scenarios. That's what Ben reported on, and I guess I would invite Ben to mention. So Bart was reporting phase 1. Let's try and forget about phase 1, and we're really talking about phase 2, and I guess I would invite Ben to comment on what we're looking at in terms of unit demands.
Jerry, the phase 1 study, you can see the basis for those calculations in that study, and they were built up. They were didn't just pull a number in terms of barrels per barrel out and multiply it by the size of the industry. And so you can go look at those individual components and decide whether or not you like them or not. But in phase 2, we made a pretty aggressive effort to get involved with working with industry, and we worked with Glenn and others. I won't mention any names because I don't want to get them in trouble. We did work with them, and we got information from industry which helped us refine our unit water use estimates for the various components of production. And so you can see our numbers are a little bit lower, but the principal reason that they're lower is because we were able to incorporate an estimate of the amount of co-produced water, which offsets the overall water use required by various components of the industry. Now, in some cases, industry's estimates were higher than the phase 1 estimates. In many cases, they were lower, but you can see the net result. So we think they're better estimates, and we don't think, I think that we should really present the range. And so I think we're probably going to do that, and there's a substantial uncertainty in the unit water use intensities, but an even bigger uncertainty in the size of the industry, which will really drive what you think the future's going to look like.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? I think that was, you noted that earlier during your presentation, that a big change between the demands was the groundwater, kind of excluding the co-produced water.
No, yeah.
Co-produced water. The question, I guess, is how much of that is groundwater that could be tributary or would otherwise be available for use? I mean, the notion of like taking that out of the equation strikes me as you could treat that a different way. You could say that this is water that would be available for other uses.
Yeah, no, this water is, remember that the industry isn't going to want to heat the water up, so they're going to dewater these cells beforehand, and they have to manage that as part of Colorado's water rights system. But the water that's co-produced is water of combustion, water of dehydration, that would not otherwise be available for beneficial use. And so I'm sure this will be litigated someday, that somebody will claim that that's their water, but my prediction is that it'll be viewed as new water, and thus it'll be fully consumable under Colorado's water law. Mark?
Yes, you talked about limitations of the amount of water based upon the compact and availability of water, having to take water out of agriculture. But one thing you didn't mention is the legal limitations, and that is under the Endangered Species Act. Bart mentioned a little bit about the fact that in the Colorado River, the amount of water that is right now kind of available under the Endangered Species Act and the programmatic biological opinion was 60,000 acre-feet. Well, some of that has already been used. But we're talking about amounts much larger than that, and there are also much smaller amounts that are covered by the biological opinion on the Amber River. And we're not talking, what limitations are you thinking about in relationship to the Endangered Species Act's effects on the availability of taking more water out of the Colorado River Basin? Because a lot of you know, the amount of water that's there now is many times not even sufficient for the fish, and the flows, et cetera, and the timing. So I just want you to know, did you at all, or are you thinking of eventually looking at the implications of the limitations under the Endangered Species Act?
I think it's a good question, and from my perspective, I didn't mean to gloss that over. I'll give you a few thoughts about that. But you know, I wear a few different hats, and one of them is I live in the Yampa Basin, and I'm on the board of directors of a conservancy district who's one of the opposers to Shale's filing in the Yampa. And one of the things that we've said to Shale in just very preliminary and informal discussions with them is, you know, don't think that you're going to be able to utilize the PBO's depletion allowance in the Yampa. You're going to have to go out and get your own consultation to meet that. And from strictly my personal perspective, that would be something that I think would be something we'd insist on in any type of settlement. In the Colorado River, you know, there's this depletion allowance in the Colorado River. It's basically, you know, it's first in time, first in right, if you will. And how that's going to play out, I don't know. But, you know, if there's not depletion allowance available, then they're going to have to get a separate consultation. There is no PBO in the White River, and I would expect there's going to be a significant amount of depletions. The River District has, when we finish the PBO on the 15-mile reach, a condition of that is putting PBOs in place in the other basins. Gunson's just been done, the Yampa was done a number of years ago,
right.
And really what we're talking about is everything else, which is basically the White River. So we're advocating for the PBO to be put in place. I think for this and other reasons, it needs to contemplate what's going to happen or what could happen for development. So in my mind, at least, that's a very important issue.
Well, and I'd also like to point out, people were talking about the baseline impact. the Colorado River program is relied upon by water users in the Colorado Basin in 3 states.
Right.
So we're talking about potential impacts on a program that affects Wyoming and Utah as well. And so that's, we have more of a basin-wide impact as well on that.
And if I can just add a couple things, I've been involved in that recovery program for about the last 7 or 8 years, and it's interesting, in the Yampa, it's very much tied into the Green River in the sense that the notions of flow and the provisions of flows for fish in the Green River assume that the Yampa will continue to deliver peak flows. They're actually, the releases from Flame Gorge Reservoir are tied and matched to the flushing flows that come out of the Yampa. So you're right, there's both this issue of reconsultation that might be required with the Fish and Wildlife Service for that depletion, but it's also could have a trigger effect or ripple effect on the Green River. And I think, Margot, I'd answer your question saying I agree that the analysis that's being done on Energy 2 should find a way to run some scenarios that involve the endangered species restrictions or limitations or guidelines, however you want to describe it. And I think one natural outcome of that, based on your presentation, Dan, would be there might not be as much new conditional water available, at least in the Colorado Basin, which would force a little bit more or a lot more of the use of existing decreed rights, that is the ditch rights. And so if it is not available as a conditional right, then oil shale companies would have to look to acquire existing water uses and transfer from the agricultural use to an industrial.
Back.
I want to apologize ahead of time because I'm from the east. I for the record don't understand Western water. But
We don't either.
looking at your case study about 1.5 million barrel a day, we are talking about pipelines that are going to be in place, long distance pipelines from possibly. Water is such an easy commodity to move by pipeline, and the industry will pay a lot for it. At that size of an industry, I think we can talk about other sources besides the Colorado, very long range sources. Because industry can afford to pay a lot for that water.
I'll start with that. I think it's a fair question. I think it's really a question for industry. What we're seeing is not anything about the industry looking at a pipeline from the Mississippi or anything like that. What we're seeing is them doing filings in the Yampa to move water into the Piceance Basin. We're seeing energy looking at moving water from the Colorado into the Piceance. Bards, they've got conditional water rights totaling thousands of CFS and 100,000 acre feet. The evidence is that they're really thinking about using local sources. I mean, if industry has different ideas, certainly would make our lives a little bit easier.
It's too bad on the panel we don't have someone from Las Vegas, because they have and probably would conceive of every possible source, including icebergs from Alaska, to meet that need. But I agree with Dan that the analysis we did shows that at least the conditional rights and the decreed rights, it's local sources, local river basins, and I think it's fair to say cornering the market on most of those rights available from the White Peninsula, for instance.
Yes, Bart, I know you removed one conditional abandoned water right, Una Reservoir, from your table, but there are still numerous conditional abandoned water rights and duplicate points of diversion that are still on the table, and the report itself has never been updated. There's still the same numbers online. Do you intend to go through that list and update that information?
I would answer that it'd be important that the report, the results from 10 months ago when we released it, were based on what was in the state engineer's office records at that point. And I remember the River District, the day that report came out, said, "Oh, well, wait." And I think we did go back for that large right, and at least for the purposes of these slides, scrub it out of there. But I think it's important that, at least in the eyes of the state engineer's office, if anyone in this room goes to the tabulation, they're gonna find most of those rights there. The abandonment proceedings or the actual retirement of those rights hasn't happened.
Well, it happened a long time ago.
Well,
Yeah.
but from the state engineer's perspective, it's still in the tabulation. So I think, I don't know of plans to go back and redo all the numbers, but I think it'd be important, the take-home message is even if a few of those are adjusted, there are still many times over the paper water rights that the industry would need. It's still a dramatic volume.
Yeah, but for consistency, it should be made accurate.
But,
More questions? Yes.
Just as a follow-up to the comment from a friend from the east here, I guess I'm originally from the east, and don't understand much of the water rights either.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Sure. One of the things I think that begs to be said in that previous discussion about basically industry bringing the water with them is a consideration of the fact that should the industry start taking off and the water demand become at a certain level, then, and I don't know how it would functionally do this, but then you say, well, then you bring your water with you. So if there was some mechanism, again, not understanding water rights or water law, being able to say, all right, we're going to provide you enough water here to see if your industry is viable or not. Once it starts kicking off, you're really providing lots of pipelines that take oil away. You also need to string those pipelines to bring water in, so it doesn't affect the local water usage. I don't know if that's being a possibility in the realm of the way things are done in the West, but I guess I'd like your comments.
I don't think it would work in the context of Western water law, but I mean, when you made that comment, the first thing that leapt to my mind is, what would come out of some type of NEPA process for the industry, and I don't know if that's would be a possibility or not.
You guys don't want that question, do you?
Well, I guess my only answer is that the current proposals do assume moving water around quite a bit. I mean, bringing it from the White or from the Amber River, the newest application, that would bring the water at least 40 miles, I think, to the point of use. And I think many of the proposals out there are both reservoirs and pipelines to move water around. So in essence, I think there is the notion that if this development happens, the water is acquired or developed and brought to the place of use.
Any more questions?
Mark, you said that the oil shale industry is going to affect climate change. Could you explain yourself?
I'm a water lawyer and not a person who works on climate science, but there are probably several others in the room who can speak to the issue of how much energy is used. But the basic point was the amount of energy that would go into the development of the resource. I think the River District and others in the roundtable showed that many of the elements of water use are related to electricity power generation, and the assumption there is that much of that would be through fossil generation. I don't think I've heard some people throw around the idea of renewables meeting some of the need, but at least some of that would come from gas plants or coal plants, and those would certainly contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, and potentially in large amounts.
And why aren't you using the term global warming anymore? No, I'm confused by this global warming, this climate change, all this stuff that, I'm watching Al Gore get richer every day off this stuff. So
That certainly seems like a full day of discussion for another.
That is a big question. Let's move on. Yes.
Ben, what's your estimated date of completion for phase 2?
We're scheduled to finish this in June. At the end of the month, but I can't remember.
June at the end of the month.
We'll say late June. We have time for one more? Let me return this offer that I took away from you guys. Is there any questions or any testing you want to do to each other here? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I did have a question. There were a lot of numbers going around, but what I kind of got lost in is according to the water rates that the oil companies have already, what size industry would that supply if it were based on combustion process and not a electricity generation?
You know, that's a very difficult question to answer because you have to go look at the yield of each water rights. You know, what Bart's given you are headgate capacities and reservoir capacities, and you have to go back and do a bunch of arithmetic to figure out just how much water that's going to yield. But without any electricity, I mean, probably, I would guess, just based on the magnitude of the water rights, there would be enough to supply the direct production of that 1.5 million barrel per day industry. There's not that much water that goes into the on-the-ground production of oil shale. It's the upgrading and then, of course, the electrical production that really requires a lot of water.
I guess I'll go back to what I said. You know, at the levels that we're talking about, I don't see water as the limiting factor for oil shale.
To put it in perspective, Colorado uses a couple of million acre feet, consumes a couple million acre feet of water. It's important to get that distinction. Consumptive use is about 2 million acre feet in recent years. The capacity of the system is about 2.7 million acre feet right now if everybody was using as much water as they were entitled to. So that puts it in a little more perspective. And the other point I guess I would make in response to what Bart said about the compact is the compact does give the Upper Basin a junior priority on the river, but also gave us a senior right for the present perfected rights, those rights that were perfected prior to whatever the date turns out to be that the compact is declared to be executed. And those water rights would be not subject to administration under a compact call, and so you can, and I think this gets to the point we've heard before in response to Margot's question about endangered species and other things. There's a lot of reasons to believe that industry would prefer to just go out and buy water, just buy absolute rights that predate the compact and avoid the potential interruption of production that might come from using these junior rights.
Let's wrap it up with that. So, let's join the table.